In modern popular culture, philosophy is dismissed as at best pointless navel-gazing, or as an unproductive distraction, and at worst a source of dangerous and destructive ideas. In any case, not something a normal person should be bothered with. I do agree that philosophy, where there is an absence of methodology for investigation, can lead to intellectual dead ends and destructive ideas. I do not agree with the notion that the study of ideas and their implications should be sequestered to academia or hermits in mountaintop caves. The following is my attempt to make the case that not only is philosophical insight necessary for the general population, but that the proper methodology for investigating these ideas provide the fundamental structure needed to achieve free will. My purpose is not to say what to think, but to provide some of the tools to map the world out for yourself. Nothing I write is new. I am just organizing it in order to make my case. The journey is yours to take. In his book, The Republic, Plato described a cave in order to illustrate the intellectual state of people in the world around him. He imagined that they were like prisoners chained inside a cave facing a wall, with a fire behind them. Unknown people would use the fire shining past various objects to project shadows on the wall for the prisoners to see. The prisoners were chained in a way that they could only see the shadows, so they took them as reality. One man is released from his chains and compelled to turn around. He sees the puppeteers and the distant sunlights at the cave entrance. His ascent to the cave entrance occurs in stages, against his will, until he finally arrives outside the cave. At first, he is blinded by the sunlight and disoriented, but as his eyes adjust, he is amazed by the discoveries he makes in the world outside the cave. The man has an epiphany. What he believed was real inside the cave were merely phantoms, shadows on the wall created by the puppeteers beguiling the prisoners for their own inscrutable purposes. The former prisoner, now able to experience freedom of thought and action, desires to go back into the cave and share his discovery with those still imprisoned within, so that they could experience the same freedom he now enjoys. When he returns to the cave, he finds that his experience has changed him, and he is unable to see in the darkness of the cave. Exposure to reality had rendered what was inside the cave to be nonsensical, effectively blinding the man. When he makes it back to the prisoners with his revelation, he is met not with gratitude, but hostility. The prisoners take his apparent blindness as harm caused to the man from his experience outside the cave. Not wishing that harm to come to them, they would rise up if they could and kill the man. The hostility demonstrated by the other prisoners is a result of existential panic. They had come to identify with the reality provided to them in the form of shadows on the wall, to the point that their very identities depended on the shadows being true. Any challenge to that perception, however well-intentioned, would pose a direct threat to their identities. This allegory implies that leaving the cave is not voluntary, happens in stages, and involves discomfort at every stage. It is further implied that the state of imprisonment is a naturally occurring state we are born into. My opinion is that culture is the mechanism by which the chains are attached. I believe that the exit from this metaphorical cave can be voluntary. With the right intellectual tools, the prisoners could have separated their identities from the shadows, evaluated those images independently, and chosen to exit the cave and walk in the light. Our ability to discern the difference between shadow and substance is critical to even the possibility of freedom. Without it, we wouldn't even know there is freedom to be had. There is a process we can follow to discover what the truth is. You don't need to understand everything to be able to navigate in the world. You may have heard the allegory about a fish being unaware that they are swimming in water. There are various citations about the origin of this observation, ranging from speeches given to an old Chinese proverb. If you want to know about the water, don't ask a fish. The origins of this proverb are not as important to me as the concept that what surrounds us in our day-to-day lives becomes invisible, paradoxically, because it is ubiquitous. Like the hum of a fan that becomes inaudible until you pay attention to it, our philosophical worldview can blind us to otherwise obvious contradictions between real-world observations and preconceptions. Having a way to change our perspective is a good way to compare what we believe to what we observe. Part of the philosophical water that we swim in is unthinking assumptions about the definitions of the words we use to describe the world and to describe concepts. What does fair mean? What is justice? The assumptions we make about these definitions may not be the same as someone we are trying to talk to about them, so it is important to be clear with ourselves about the definitions we are using before we try to communicate our ideas to others. As a simple exercise, try with a few of your own definitions. For instance, fair, trust, and courage. Don't look them up. Write down what they mean to you, and then check them against what the dictionary says. Then, if you have a friend that is willing to have them define the same concepts, and compare those definitions. The odds of there being minor differences in at least one term are good, even if you and your friend share the same worldview. When you compound those differences across a broad range of ideas, you can see the misunderstandings that can emerge if definitions are not clearly understood, to the point where people are talking about entirely different things using the same words. There is another aspect to this problem: words as camouflage. When someone with bad intent wants to manipulate or exploit individuals or groups, they can rely on their target's assumptions about definitions. Politicians are well known for this, dispensing nebulous platitudes upon which their followers project their own hopes and fears. The people that make up these various factions even actively participate in their own deception via the fallacy of selection bias, ignoring or minimizing information that contradicts their favored narrative, and emphasizing the same information as it pertains to the leaders of the opposing factions. When we allow these contradictions to accumulate around us, they crowd out our ability to differentiate reality from illusion. Thus, we become victims of the illusionists. The question of self-ownership may seem to be so self-evident that it remains beneath consideration. I contend that answering this question and understanding the answer is the foundation upon which every ethical framework ever devised has rested, knowingly or not. If you own yourself, you own the results of your actions, for good or ill. If you are owned, in whole or in part, the responsibility of your actions are displaced to an external force. If you are owned, you place your moral volition and responsibility in an external force. Most people I have talked to about this question assert that, of course, they own themselves. How could it be otherwise? They argue that only a slave is owned, and they are not a slave. I believe that self-ownership is the natural state of being, and can never be surrendered, willingly or otherwise. I understand if this seems an impossible proposition. There are thousands of years of slavery that appear to counter my argument conclusively. Allow me to make my case. The would-be masters have only force and fraud at their disposal. They can threaten violence or death, or convince you that they are your betters and you owe them your productivity. They can never own you. They can only kill you. Slavery is cooperation under duress. I am not an apologist for slavery. Slavery is an evil institution and more prevalent in the modern world than generally recognized, but cannot be properly resisted without sufficiently understanding it. If you deny yourself the power of choice, it makes your would-be master's job easier if you retain your power to choose. Even if you choose to cooperate with coercion, you have taken a step to free your mind, even if your body is imprisoned. If you are convinced that your situation is just the way it is, you have denied yourself the ability to resist. In 1961, Stanley Milgram conducted a series of experiments at Yale University to measure compliance to a perceived authority. These studies were conducted in light of the Nuremberg trials going on at the time. Dr. Milgram himself wanted to know if what happened in Nazi Germany could happen in the United States, or indeed in any other modern Western nation. After all, prior to Hitler, Germany was a modern republic. The setup of the experiment was simple. The test subjects were recruited from the local community through want ads, asking for teachers to help in a scientific study of memory and learning. These teachers were the actual subjects of the study, though they thought they were only assisting as teachers. The method, so the subjects were told, was to test the effectiveness of negative reinforcement on learning. The negative reinforcement, in this case, was a series of electric shocks, ranging from undetectable to 450 volts. The results of the initial experiment is that over 60% delivered the 450 volt shock, and everyone delivered 300 volts. No actual shocks were delivered. The students were part of the investigation staff and had predetermined lines to say as the experiment progressed, ranging from complaining about heart trouble, cries of pain, and finally, no response at all. The authority figure was represented by a man in a lab coat, armed with only a clipboard, and whose only means of compulsion were verbal. There was a predetermined series of statements for him as well. 1. Please continue. 2. The experiment requires that you continue. 3. It is absolutely essential that you continue. 4. You have no other choice. You must go on. If the subject still wanted to stop after 4 verbal commands, the experiment would stop, but the wish to stop had to be clear. The subjects of the study were all uncomfortable with the progression of shocks. They begged to be allowed to stop. In some cases, others even cried, but continued to follow orders. They had surrendered their volition to a perceived authority. How many Milgram experiments are you a part of without knowing it? Ask yourself why the lessons of these experiments and the many verifications of these results are not taught in every school in the world. The main legal conclusion of the Nuremberg trials was that being ordered to commit crimes against humanity did not absolve you from responsibility for committing those crimes. That lesson is also curiously absent. So, if you own yourself, what does that mean? Like the difference between owning your home and renting it. When you own your home, you are responsible for its upkeep. Where is the operator's guide to self-ownership? This podcast series seeks to answer that question. The law of the instrument states, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When we encounter a new situation or new information, we tend to try to fit it within what we already understand, disregarding or ignoring the parts of the new information or experience that doesn't fit into what we already know. This is an instinctive kind of mental shorthand we used that served us well in our hunter-gatherer days. That rustling in the grass might not be a lion, but it is safer to run. Today, there are people among us with the skill to use our instinctive fears and assumptions against us. So, to protect ourselves, we must acquire the tools to recognize these methods. Rest assured that someone attempting to manipulate you is not doing so for your benefit.